Our next two speakers are Joe and Kathy La. And we are so happy to have Joe and Kathy La, who are family to us. And they flew from Hyannisport down to be with us. And thank you very much. And they're going to share their experiences with us.
Thank you. Oh goodness, there we are. Well, I'm Kathy, and I'm just so thrilled to be here tonight. We are so excited that we got introduced to Doeguling last year, especially because of the Geshe-ma. And that leads into a story from a long time ago for me. 20 years ago, before last year, I had gone to Dharamsala just for, to look around and maybe take a class in Buddhism. I'd been a Zen Buddhist, I'd been a, Chinese Buddhist, and then I found Tibetan Buddhism. And a friend had found out in Washington that I was going to Dharamsala. And I said, what should I do? And he said, don't worry, it'll all be planned by the time you get there. And I thought, what? So the next thing I know, I'm having lunch with the Dalai Lama's sister, and then I'm being taken to the Dalai Lama to have an audience, and I'm just dumbstruck. I didn't even take a camera because I was it was such a shock. And he wanted to talk to me. Clearly this friend in Washington had something in his mind. And as we talked, he said, what did you like most? And I said, I loved going to Doeguling Nunnery. I just was so moved by the nunnery and the nuns. And he said, oh, I'm so glad you said that. I am going to educate the nuns just like the monks. So here we are, 20 years later, and I'm in Doeguling, and the nuns are getting the Geshe-ma. And one of them is my Tibetan son's cousin. I mean, it was just like, it was a miracle. It was a miracle for me. And so we've been passionate about helping Tibetans. The other thing that the Dalai Lama did in that initial talk with me, at the end I said, my husband works at the World Bank, and if there's anything we can do to help. And he said, I need you to go to China. And my face dropped. I didn't ask any more questions. I got back to Washington, D.C., and what happens? I get a phone call. Oh, this is Lodi Gary, and I work with His Holiness, and I'd just like to meet you and hear about your trip. So I go to meet him and hear about the trip. And he says, well, we have this little project we're thinking of doing inside Tibet. It's called the Bridge Fund, and we want to do some small projects. Nothing really big, but we think the Chinese will let us go into Tibet and do these little projects. So there we went, off to Tibet. Here you see the Geshe-ma picture. Now I need the next picture. It's all right.
That's emptiness.
Anyway, the next picture was that we went for about yes, here it is. Nope, that one. This is a nunnery in Tibet. It's in, what, Yushu? Yunnan. It's in Yunnan. And it's one of the projects, one of the little projects we did. These nuns had moved into a monastery, which was very, very old when the monks got a new monastery. And of course, they were living in a place where they were all very ill. So we helped them. We provided the materials, and they built these new dormitories and the new bathrooms and kitchen and whatnot. So here I was fulfilling this wish of the Dalai Lama by helping the nuns there. Now if we go to the next one, here is Choling in Doeguling, and this is when it was started in 1987, a few years before I went to Tibet. And the next picture, please. And here you see it now, just prospering and doing so very well. And we'll go on to the next picture. So this is the Geshe-ma. The other exciting thing that happened to me at the Geshe-ma is that my Tibetan son that you see on the right, who's a member of Sewang's family, but I adopted him and got him through school. Well, he's meeting his cousin, who is one of the first Geshe-ma, and she's from Zhangchul nunnery. So there were just all these little miracles that have kept us coming back and to finally have a new project, because we had to leave Tibet in about 1906. 2006, we couldn't do any more projects. They just shut us down. And so we've been so happy when Sewang and Shimi said, come to Doeguling and see if you can, do some work there. So we're just thrilled to be part of your community, because we're just passionate about Tibetans. Thank you.
Sewang, is this working? Can you hear me?
Here, use this one.
Okay. Sewang's charge to us was, tell us what excites you about Doeguling and the RDTS initiative. I think you've gathered from my wife what excites her about Doeguling. For me, more of a kind of analytic type. I had to get there through a series of steps, and I'm going to share a couple of those steps with you. The first step actually happened while we were in Doeguling, and on the very day that my wife saw the Geshe-ma degrees awarded to the first nuns. On that same day, they awarded the Geshe degrees. That is kind of roughly the equivalent for the non-Tibetans in the audience of our PhDs, to the people who'd qualified after roughly 20 years of study. And to be candid with you, I was blown away when I looked around the place where we were sitting. There were literally hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of monks who were receiving this degree. So being an analytic type, the question that popped into my mind is, what in the world are all these people going to do? I mean, there were hundreds of them, all trained in the Buddhist tradition. Well, as it happens, this is a question which is not unique to me. And I found out while in Doeguling that it was a question that was being struggled with by some of the leading figures in the community. And what they told me was that the Nalanda tradition went through a period where, as embodied in the Tibetan tradition, where it was very much at risk after the Chinese took over Tibet. And when they fled, many of them fled, the monasteries back in Tibet were destroyed or put under such incredible restrictions they couldn't practice their beliefs. But over that period of time, which is now approaching 50 years, the challenges, the risks to the Nalanda tradition, at least in the physical sense, have been confronted and largely met. So what these leaders told me was that the time had come now to put a little less emphasis on protecting the tradition, particularly in the form of building more buildings for debates or training, and to focus more on spreading the benefits of that tradition to the wider world. And that was an image, a vision, if you like, which I found very compelling, and it was reinforced by a couple of experiences which represented the next steps in my process of building my excitement. One step was meeting the leaders and the members of the RDTS initiative in the flesh, on the ground, in Doeguling. Just a couple of observations about that. First of all, the leadership of RDTS is absolutely outstanding. This is a community of 16,000 people, 8,000 monks, 8,000 not monks, and yet the leadership that Sewang had managed to bring together from the monastic and the non-monastic side, extremely impressive. The man who was in charge of the overall managing committee, Shatse Kempo, is one of the most impressive individuals I've met anywhere, in any capacity. Fully invested in His Holiness's vision that the time has come to focus on the spread of the benefits that can be derived from the Nalanda tradition. And then at the kind of working level, the day-to-day level, there was Namgyala, the head of the cooperative society, who again is an incredibly impressive person. He's perhaps not impressive in the sense that he would give you a speech that would blow you away. He's impressive in the sense that he gets things done. He makes things happen. He can span the gap between X and Y and bring them together to make them happen. So number one, we have in Doeguling a leadership that is really pretty outstanding. The second thing is, amongst all the members of the managing group, the managing committee, one found a focus on pragmatism, on results that was pretty impressive. What they wanted more than anything else was to find some things they could do which would bring benefits to the community that would begin a process building momentum towards this larger and obviously long-term vision. So they weren't at all content with just, being a talk shop. They wanted to find things which would actually produce results. And out of the conversation that took place over the time we were there, they developed 3 working groups or committees. One focused on health, one focused on water, and one focused on the youth employment issues. And Dara's in a moment going to tell you a little something about the work on health. We've already had a fairly extensive discussion with leaders from the Kuduk about the youth employment angle. I just want to say a word about the water committee. One of the things about the water committee was that, as with all the committees, we said it's not enough that an issue is important to the community itself. We have to be able to identify individuals in the community on the ground who are sufficiently passionate about the issue in front of them that they will devote the time and energy to make something happen. And in the case of the water committee, we had a young man, Tenzing Takta, who was just that. I mean, it was a pleasure to see him. He had been out on visits, had seen water projects elsewhere, and he came back and worked with others to develop a pilot project that is what we call water harvesting. That is, during the short rainy season, a lot of water in this community falls on impermeable places, on roofs and on paved areas. And unlike most communities, because of the monasteries in Doeguling, there's a lot of impermeable areas. So the idea was to develop a pilot scheme that would show that you could economically collect water, in this case from Rato Monastery, who maybe was a little unsure at the beginning, but has now become enthusiastic supporters of this project. And in fact, that first project is being followed up by a second project at a different monastery, all demonstrating, hopefully, to the rest of the community and the rest of the people who have monasteries or big public buildings, that this is something they can do too. And this was one of the 2 areas where the Tibet Fund agreed to provide startup finance last year. So that was one step that made me think, hey, this is more than just a bright idea. There's a group of people there, including some with real passion for change, who can make something happen. The second step was a little further afield. When my wife and I came back from Doeguling, we found that a couple of nuns from the nunnery that my wife is very engaged in had been selected to come to Emory University in Atlanta to study science as part of a much broader Emory Tibet Science Initiative. And in fact, when we were in Doeguling, we attended a conference which prominent scientists from around the world had gathered to talk about the progress that had been made to break down the barriers between Tibetan Buddhist scholars and Western scientists. So that's a story for another day. In any event, my wife being the compassionate one, said, we have to go down to Emory and greet these nuns. They're coming from halfway around the world. They're going to a big American university. It'll be good to see some familiar faces and get some friendly support. And we did that, and that part of it was successful. But while we were there, we got exposed to what's been going on at Emory University. Now, some of you may know this. I didn't know it at all. Emory University has this science initiative, which in itself would be something to be proud of as an accomplishment after 10 years. It's just one of a handful of major programs that have been developed at this university. One program, which maybe is smaller but very important to Doeguling, is that the university now takes large groups of students every year to India. They divide their time between Dharamsala and Doeguling, and they learn about the Tibetan tradition. So the idea of beginning to bring people who are genuinely interested in the Tibetan tradition to Doeguling, that's not a theory, that's not a hope, that's something that's underway, that's happening. The question is, how can it be built on and expanded and done in a way which creates opportunities for the people in Doeguling? So that's one program. Another program is something called cognitively based compassion training. That's a mouthful, and they use initials CBCT. It basically is drawing on the Nalanda tradition to provide people with guidance on how they can develop a sense of compassion and how that can help their lives in a variety of ways. It's a big program. It's a growing program. It's part of, we have the Nalanda Institute people here, so I won't go on about it, but that also, that part of the program would have been a big accomplishment for 10 years. That wasn't all, and I won't list all the rest of them, but I will list this one last one. Beginning just in the last few months, they have established an institute for, I think it's called Contemporary Ethics, with an $11 million grant from the Dalai Lama Trust. And the focus of this institute is to promote the agenda that His Holiness has been talking about for the last few years, which is precisely to find ways to draw on the Nalanda tradition to enrich a variety of secular pursuits, whether it's the healing professions, the Nalanda, whether it's in the corporate world, as Taewong in his bank, or in the schools. And this institute will promote what has already begun on a small scale to a much larger audience. Now, so what conclusion does one draw from that? The conclusion I draw is that a small number of dedicated people with real passion about making fuller and better use of the Nalanda tradition to benefit the wider world can make a big difference. And let me tell you, I'm perfectly aware that my discovery at Emory could be matched. There are probably half a dozen people in this audience who could tell a similar story about a different way in which they came across this. There's been an absolute explosion of work done, whether it's in the healing professions, whether it's in the corporate world, whether it's in the educational institutions, that draw on this Nalanda tradition. So, and bringing it back now to Doeguling is that as these have developed, they have begun to promote a small but growing flow of people, both from the outside into Doeguling. I mentioned the students, but also there are people who've gone there for teaching science teachers, and some from Doeguling the other way. The two nuns are an example. And I hope and expect this flow will grow in the future years and be a practical, tangible way of helping to realize His Holiness's vision about bringing Nalanda to the rest of the world. Thank you.